It was a Tuesday morning in Tokyo, and by every surface measurement, Flight 351 was a nothing flight, a short domestic hop from Haneda Airport to Fukuoka, 2.5 hours at most. 122 passengers, a crew of 7, a plane called the Yodo. About 12 minutes after takeoff, 9 young men stood up from their seats throughout the cabin. They were carrying katana swords. One of them was 16 years old, still in high school. Another was holding what was described as a homemade bomb. They told the pilot to fly to North Korea. And then things got stranger. March 31st, 1970. The Yodo, a Boeing 727, the name meaning still water, lifted off from Haneda Airport at 7:33 in the morning. The flight was scheduled to take less than 3 hours. It ended up taking 4 days. The 9 hijackers were members of the Red Army faction, or Kiyosando Sekigun-ha, a radical student group that had splintered from the Communist League and concluded that the time for marches and petitions was over. They ranged in age from 16 to 27. Their leader was Tamiya Takamaro, 27 years old, a veteran of campus protests. The youngest was Yasuhiro Shibata, 16, a second-year high school student who had boarded the plane with a sword hidden in his belongings. They were armed with katana swords and what the investigation described as a homemade explosive device. 12 minutes after takeoff, they stood and announced they had seized control of the aircraft. Their demand was simple: fly them to Pyongyang, North Korea. They called this operation the opening move of a communist revolution. The pilot diverted to Fukuoka, telling the hijackers the plane needed to refuel. On the ground at Fukuoka, some passengers managed to get off. Japanese authorities tried to negotiate at the gate. The hijackers refused to stand down. Eventually, the plane took off again and flew northwest towards South Korea. What the 9 did not know was that Japanese and South Korean authorities had been in contact. In the hours while the plane was on the ground in Fukuoka, something quietly extraordinary was being arranged at Gimpo Airport in Seoul. When the Yodo touched down at Gimpo, the hijackers looked out the windows. The signs were in Korean. Soldiers stood on the tarmac in military uniforms. The hijackers stepped off the plane, believing without question that they had arrived in Pyongyang. South Korean airport authorities had repainted visible signage and positioned military personnel to create the surface appearance of a North Korean military facility. The deception held for 3 days. During those 3 days, passengers were gradually released in exchange for concessions: fuel, tire repairs, assurances. By the end of the Seoul standoff, all 122 passengers had been freed. And then, Japan's Vice Minister of Transport, Shinjiro Yamamura, did something that no one had ordered him to do. He walked voluntarily onto the aircraft and offered himself as a replacement hostage. In exchange, the last civilians were allowed off. Yamamura remained on board as the plane prepared to fly north for real. Eventually, the deception came apart. Japanese newspapers were showing photographs of Gimpo tarmac and calling it Seoul. The hijackers were reportedly shown the papers and refused at first to believe them. It said that it was only through contact with actual North Korean officials, and perhaps the creeping inconsistencies of the staged environment, that they finally accepted the truth. They had been in Seoul the whole time. And still they pressed on. On April 3rd, 1970, the Yodo crossed the 38th parallel. It landed at Mirim Airport, on the outskirts of Pyongyang. North Korea received the 9 as revolutionary heroes. They were given military honors, political asylum, and accommodation in a secure compound that later accounts describe as the Village of Revolution. Vice Minister Yamamura and the remaining crew were released on April the 5th and flew back to Japan. The 9 stayed. What made the hijacking possible, on the most practical level, was the near-total absence of weapons screening on Japanese domestic flights in 1970. The 9 boarded a short domestic route, Tokyo to Fukuoka, one of the most routine in the country, carrying katana swords and explosive materials without triggering any alarm. This was Japan's first ever aircraft hijacking. The security infrastructure that we now take for granted, the scanners, the checked bag protocols, the no-fly considerations, did not exist here. The Red Army faction had planned the operation over weeks, possibly months. They chose their seats deliberately, distributing themselves across the cabin so that when they stood simultaneously, there was no obvious focal point for crew or passengers to rush. They chose a domestic route because the shorter distance meant lighter oversight and faster access. The choice of North Korea as their destination was entirely ideological. Kim Il-sung's regime had positioned itself as a sponsor of international revolutionary movements, and the Red Army faction had concluded that North Korea would train them militarily and help them launch a guerrilla return to Japan. They had imagined themselves as the vanguard of a coming revolution. The Gimpo deception was the authorities' answer. South Korean and Japanese officials had little time to construct it. What they built, repainted signs, repositioned soldiers, was rudimentary. But it held for 3 days, and it held long enough to free all 122 passengers. Whether it was ever designed to prevent the plane from ultimately reaching North Korea is unclear. It may simply have been a way to buy time. What is remarkable about the standoff is not the deception, but what came after it. Vice Minister Yamamura's voluntary decision to board. There was no protocol for this. He walked on because he believed it would free the last hostages. He was right. He came home. To understand why 9 young people walked onto that plane with swords, you have to understand Japan in 1970. The country was in the grip of one of the most intense student radical movements in its history. The US-Japan Security Treaty, ANPO, had divided the country for a decade. In 1960, hundreds of thousands of people had taken to the streets when Prime Minister Kishi pushed the treaty's ratification through the Diet. By 1970, the treaty was up for renewal again, and the anger had compounded. Japan was also watching the Vietnam War escalate under American direction. Many in the student movement saw Japan's alliance with the United States as direct complicity. The Red Army faction was the most extreme edge of that movement. Where mainstream student groups believed in organizing and mass protest, the faction had decided that armed action was the only meaningful response. They were inspired by Palestinian militant groups, by Cuba, by Mao's Cultural Revolution. They had adopted the language of revolution in absolute terms. Compromise was collaboration. Passivity was surrender. Action was everything. Most of the 9 were students or recent students. They were not from desperate poverty. Several had been involved in campus protests before concluding that protests weren't enough. What they shared was a closed social world in which every conversation reinforced the same set of conclusions and in which a 16-year-old could pick up a sword because everyone he trusted said that this was what the moment required. They believed they were making history. They believed North Korea would train them and send them back. They believed the revolution was close. There is something almost impossible to sit with about what the Yodo-go hijacking became, because it didn't end in victory or martyrdom. It ended, slowly, over decades, in complicity. The 9 who boarded that plane were operating inside a closed ideological loop. Radicalization initiated in a tight-knit group rarely announces itself as madness. What it looks like from the inside is clarity. The logic is internally consistent. The conclusions follow from the premises. The outside world, family members who expressed concern, fellow students who refused to take up weapons, authorities who tried to negotiate, had all been categorized as either enemies or cowards. Doubt, by the time action was taken, had been fully socialized out of the group. Kim Il-sung's regime read this dynamic immediately and knew exactly how to exploit it. The 9 were celebrated. They were given weapons training, military status, accommodation, recognition. For the first years, it said that the hijackers genuinely believed they were still working toward revolution in Japan, that Pyongyang was a transit point, not a final destination. But the years passed, the revolution did not come, and North Korea had other uses for men who spoke Japanese, understood Japanese culture, and were too far outside the law to go home. 8 Japanese women were brought to Pyongyang through deception to become wives to the hijackers. How exactly this was arranged is not fully documented, but it is alleged that at least some of the women were told they were traveling overseas for work or study. They arrived in North Korea and could not leave. Their existence in Pyongyang was concealed from Japan for years. It wasn't until 1992 when Kim Il-sung casually revealed it during a meeting with a Japanese newspaper delegation that Japan learned the hijackers' wives had been there all along. And it didn't stop there. Some sources allege that the hijackers and their wives participated in operations designed to lure additional Japanese nationals from European cities to North Korea in the 1980s. 3 young Japanese travelers who disappeared while abroad in Europe are among the 13 Japanese abductees formally acknowledged by the North Korean government in 2002. The men who had hijacked that plane to liberate Japan from imperialism had become, over the course of 2 decades, instruments of one of the most repressive states on earth. Whether they rationalized this to themselves, whether the revolutionary framework could stretch far enough to justify what they were doing, is something we don't know. The closed ideological world that had made them capable of action in 1970 may have continued to provide cover for what came after. What we know is what they did. Of the 9 young men who boarded the Yodo on the morning of March 31, 1970, the fates diverged in ways that stretch across 5 decades. Yasuhiro Shibata, the 16-year-old student, the youngest of them all, eventually traveled back to Japan on a false passport in 1988. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served his sentence. He is the only member of the group who has faced a Japanese court for the hijacking itself. Yoshimi Tanaka was arrested in Thailand in 2000, reportedly found in possession of counterfeit American currency. He was returned to Japan and prosecuted. Tamiya Takamaro, the leader, died in North Korea. The exact circumstances remain unclear. It's said that he died in the 1990s, and there are accounts suggesting he fell out of favor with Kim Jong-il's government after Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, that his views were no longer compatible with the new leadership. This isn't confirmed. The fate of another member, Takeshi Okamoto, is disputed. Some accounts say he was killed while attempting to escape North Korea. Others leave his end ambiguous. The remaining members are believed to still be in North Korea. In 2004, surviving hijackers reportedly sent a letter to the North Korean government asking for assistance in arranging their return to Japan. Japan's police have kept outstanding arrest warrants active for those who have never been prosecuted. No one else has come home. The Yodo-go Hijacking was the first aircraft hijacking in Japanese aviation history. It happened in a country with no anti-hijacking protocols, no airport screening, no framework for what to do when someone stands up in a domestic cabin with a sword. Japan built all of that in the years that followed, but the human cost of those 4 days in 1970 was paid not only by the passengers on the plane, all of whom survived, or by Vice Minister Yamamura, who volunteered to stay and also came home. The cost continued to be paid for decades afterward by the Japanese women brought to Pyongyang without consent, and by the young travelers who vanished from European streets and never returned. 9 young men went to North Korea to start a revolution. The revolution never came, and for most of them, the country they went to never let them leave. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin, subscribe. We tell one of these a week. There's always more beneath the surface.